Action figures that we grew up with came in all shapes, all sizes, and appealed to children all over the world. Well, why is it then that certain toy lines that we grew up with in the 70s, 80s, and now the 90s are getting updated into modern counterparts for collectors? Things like Masters of the Universe Classics, which I had the honor of working on at Mattel. This is Scott Toy Guru Neitlich, and I'm your host here on Spector Creative. And let's take a look a little bit about why some toy lines seem to get updated and others not so much. Sometimes toy lines bounce around between a couple companies before they are able to have sort of an adult collector line based on the original. Sometimes it takes new content coming out in order to encourage companies to take the investment of designing a new line, be it for kids or for collectors. And other times, smaller toy companies without the overhead and publicly owned stock dividends to deal with can do a collector line on their own. Other times, links to just the heritage and vintage popularity of a line is strong enough to keep it at market even without content. I mean, Star Wars, while it's had constant content for the last 40 years, more or less, I mean, there's been some times of nothingness, like 85 to 95, but there's a lot of lines that are nostalgia based. There's the vintage line, there's the retro line that actually just re-releases the exact same, or rather copies of the exact same figures we had as kids. They're not the same tools. Tools don't last that long. Heck, they've even done characters that never got released in the vintage line, but in that style, purely as a nostalgic play. Well, it's obvious why Star Wars can support something like this when you have, constant streaming and movie content. Frank Pryor on the comment section asked me specifically about doing a video on why it takes so long for certain brands to get re-released as an adult collector line. Well, great question, but it's a little bit of a trick question, kind of like, can you lift an elephant with one hand? And there's also not one direct answer. There's quite a few. Well, good thing there's a video channel called Spector Creative that talks about these things. So, hey, let's jump in and talk about why certain toy lines get made as collector lines pretty darn quick, and others seem to take forever or are pretty much on the impossible shelf. All right. So we all obviously have favorite toys we grew up with, and heck, a lot of them have been reissued as just nostalgia-based recreations. Other things that are really obscure, like Karate from the New Adventures line. I mean, he has an action figure as part of Masters of the Universe Classics, and I never owned him as a kid, and probably few people, well, I mean, some people did, but I would say he's one of the more obscure ones. Yet something like Mask, which was huge, had its own cartoon show, none of them outside of Matt Tracker have had a modern figure, and that was kind of a whole fluke thing with G.I. Joe, which we'll get to in a bit. All right, so what are the reasons? And again, there's not one, but there's quite a few, and they sort of all add up. So let's dive in and take a look at why certain toy lines get updates, and, well, some were still patiently playing Hungry Hungry Hippos, the waiting game. The first is, who owns it? Who owns the IP? That's a big part of it. So if a toy company owns the property, like how Mattel owns Street Sharks, well, it's much easier because there's less red tape. The company can just make the toys themselves. They don't have to go through a licensor, acquire a license, pay an upfront minimum guarantee and royalty rates. Mattel has recently announced that they're doing Street Shark collector figures. They're starting off with characters that never made it into the vintage line but were concepted for that. And they're doing the same thing with some other heritage product going all the way back to the 1970s, such as Major Matt Mason and Big Jim and his pack. That's P-A-C-K. That was his, team, like the Avengers. Or Pulsar, the Ultimate Man of Action. It was kind of Mattel's version of the Bionic Man, but, a little bit more see-through and, like, blood going through his veins. Anyway, that doesn't matter. The point is, they're launching a line called Back in Action, where these characters are being re-released because Mattel owns them and can do it without asking anyone's permission. Could Food Fighters possibly be next? Well, I guess that probably comes down to one factor alone, and that's how many units is Pixel Dan's wife going to let him personally buy, and it will be enough to support the line. Hoping she lets him buy several million units, because I'd love to see Food Fighters out there. All right. But other lines, things like, Look at Brave Star, for example. Mattel made the toys in the 1980s, but Mattel doesn't own the property. Filmation does. Well, Filmation is now owned by, well, I guess Universal, if you follow the chain of command. And there have been, people asking for Brave Star figures, especially in scale to something like Masters of the Universe Classics. In fact, people have even done customs and custom ads showing what Brave Star could look like if he had been done in Classics. But the thing is, Mattel doesn't own Brave Star. So you can't just make a figure of that. Again, it requires minimum guarantees. Same thing with Black Star. I actually did a whole video on it. I'll link it here above and you can see it, where I kind of go into some of the details about doing properties like that. Heck, Mattel got Sunman, so anything is possible. The other big factor is the audience, or rather, is there an audience for a toy line? So it's not always easy to measure this and understand how many fans there are. Let's look at a good example. He-Man.org, one of my favorite websites. Obviously, He-Man, Masters of the Universe being one of my favorite properties. He-Man.org is a great community. They do really creative things. They talk about the brand, they share art from the brand, and they just generally chat about the brand and everything happening with it with different companies. So when I was at Mattel, I had the analytic department look at He-Man.org and over a 30-day period figure out how many individual posters there were. Well, of the thousands of posts, there was only 29 actual individual people posting in that particular 30 days or 2 weeks. I forget what the time period was, but the point is 29 people were posting thousands of times. It's how the internet makes you louder than numerous. One person on a keyboard posting over and over and over again can create the perception that there's a larger audience out there, and that's part of the risk. So let's look at something like Sectors, right? Awesome toy line. I actually pitched doing this several times to several companies. I thought it would be a great modern line. I mean, it's got, action figures that ride around on, basically Muppets, right? How cool is that?
Dad, what's a Muppet?
Well, it's not quite a mop, and it's not quite a puppet, but man! So to answer your question, I don't know.
Well, as much as I love Muppets or puppets being included with action figures, it's really hard to quantify if the audience is big enough to support a line like this. Doing a new line takes a lot of investment, not just with a minimum guarantee paid to the license holder, but with tooling. So an example that sort of illustrates this is Power Lords when it was re-released. So perfect example of a 1980s figure. The Four Horsemen were involved in a Glycos version of him that came out a few years ago. Really cool. They totally, updated him for modern collectors. He looked awesome, but it sold okay. It didn't sell well enough to basically expand the line and keep going. So that's a perfect example of how a line can seem to have a big enough audience, but in reality, not so much. And again, it takes a huge pile of money to make a toy line happen. I mean, you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars just on tooling alone. Then there's the good idea, bad idea factor. So sometimes lines are deliberately kept off market for multiple reasons. Marketing, strategy, spreadsheets tell you to. Well, no, just kidding. But I mean, it does sometimes come to analytics like that. So an example of this is the mask toy line, which a lot of people, not this mask toy line, this mask toy line. The one from the 80s, the one with the transforming vehicles and the helmets that go on the characters. I mean, it's one of the most toyetic concepts out there. I loved Mask, absolutely loved it when I was a kid. And it would be great to have a modern update. I would take just the figures alone. In fact, it's kind of weird. For a line I loved so much, Condor is the only figure I actually own. It was my friends that had them, and I'd go over their houses to play it. It's kind of weird that I never owned more. But anyway, I had such fond memories. So Matt Tracker, our main hero, back in the 80s, had his DeLorean-esque flying red car, which, come on, that's so cool and so 80s. And there was a modern Matt Tracker figure, not released as part of a Mask line, but released as part of a G.I. Joe line in sort of the G.I. Joe retro classic-y line. It's kind of still going along. I think it's at Walmart now. So this figure, when it came out, the idea was Mask, Mobile Armed Strike Command, was going to be a division, quote-unquote, of G.I. Joe, and Matt Tracker, or Tracker was his code name, was going to be the head of it. So this was sort of tied into Hasbro's idea of the sort of multi-property universe they were looking at creating, which I think they're still working on. They did a comic book at Comic-Con a few years ago, which was awesome. And my favorite part being that synergy from Gem was kind of what tied everything together, kind of like Nick Fury in the Marvel Universe. And I mean, I just thought that was awesome. So, Stretch Armstrong, Mask, it was all going to connect. So we got our codename Specialist Tracker figure in the G.I. Joe line that was going to head up the Mask division of G.I. Joe. And that was it. We never got another figure. We just got the one. And basically, Mask was put back in the vault, and that was a deliberate move. Well, why do that when there are fans out there who want it? It's essentially because toy companies can accidentally create their own competition. This happens all the time. Look at things like Ever After High, which was a competition to Barbie Princess, or the Barbie versus Bratz, the lawsuit that went on for like 20 years, where on the surface, the whole debate was Bratz created on Mattel's dime, if you will, and does Mattel own it because it was created by someone who was an employee of Mattel at the time, and I think used Mattel's fax machines to send it over to MGA. I don't remember all the details. It's all on the internet. You can look it up. But it wasn't all about ownership and just who owns Bratz. But one of the reasons Mattel didn't want to make Bratz in the first place and said no to it was because they didn't want to create more competition for Barbie. And, the more dolls you create, the more lines, the more options you have, and it's better to streamline all that into one concept. Mask could have taken that away from G.I. Joe. Although, personally, I still think the idea of Transformers, G.I. Joe, Masks, Gem and the Holograms, all of them being merged into one universe would make one heck of a movie and a cartoon show. And, this is basically just like dumping out our toy box in the 1980s. But, again, wanting to funnel an audience, consumers, into one brand, sometimes other brands need to be put on hold. It's a logical strategy. All right, the last one is about a brand champion. So this is a great example of a brand champion. You may be saying okay, well, who is that guy? That is Rick Ludwin. He is an executive at NBC, the Peacock network, and he was a big guy back in the 90s. He was the only one who believed in Seinfeld. Everyone else said no. This is not going to work. It's a show about nothing. And he believed in it. He was the champion, the internal champion behind the show at NBC, pushing for it to be made. And it obviously went on to be a mediocre success for NBC. It did okay to the point that having Seinfeld money has now become a saying. And well, not to compare myself, but just factually, I was the internal champion for Masters of the Universe Classics at Mattel. I really pushed to have it happen. And that's what it takes a lot of times, is sort of that one person at a company that just believes in a project and is willing to even put in the extra time, effort, and hours. I've mentioned many times how working on Matty Collector was sort of a weekend job for me. It wasn't my official job at Mattel. That was working on the DC line. And when I left Mattel, a big reason that the line, didn't continue, if you will, is because people weren't willing to do all that extra work on top of their job. I mean, obviously things like the death threats and all the fans screaming online didn't exactly help, but, either way, it wasn't getting, the big headlines that Hot Wheels or Barbie gets, where people want to work on that brand for all of the prestige that comes with it. But hey, it's a good thing because Masters of the Universe Classics got to go over to Super 7, which was a much better home for it, not only because they were a smaller company and have smaller overhead, but they were able to do things that Mattel would have never been able to do. Case in point, the William Stout collection that was a sort of homage to the 87 movie that Mattel couldn't get access to, mainly because, well, William Stout didn't want to work with Mattel, but he was willing to work with Super 7. Or some of the kind of animated look characters on vintage card backs that they did, including being able to do She-Ra and Hordak and characters again that were sort of tied up with red tape. Or, well, a perfect example is Rat Trap that they released in the Classics line, which was a character that I would have loved to have done at Mattel. I really would have. I love mummies. This was a character based on this concept art, but unfortunately there was no way of following the chain of custody that this art was created at Mattel, even though it 99.9% was. Unfortunately, Mattel Legal couldn't prove that, so this character was always off the table and not available to do. Well, with Super 7 having a mummy as their sort of logo character, I'm not surprised at all that they pushed this character forward. And again, with Super 7 being a small company and Motu Classics at Super 7 being a very small line, it was probably one of those cases where it's like no one really cared, and Mattel wasn't going to spend time and energy, I think, chasing Super 7 down and telling them not to make this character the way they could their employee, who was me. It's much easier to tell an employee what to do. So the bottom line is, why do some toy lines take a long time? Obviously, a lot of reasons, but it comes down to, is the juice worth the squeeze? I never thought we were going to see Back to the Future action figures in 6-inch, 7-inch scale. It's one of the reasons I pushed to do the hoverboard in a 6-inch scale as an accessory with the prop replica, because I always wanted a hoverboard. I never thought we'd get one. Or Princess Bride. We had a Dread Pirate Roberts years ago with NECA that did poorly and never got any other figures, but now McFarlane is doing a full line, or at least the 4 major characters. I'm really hoping for Prince Humperdinck, and hey, I'll even get the albino if they make him. And hey, maybe that's hope for things like Spaceballs. It's been notoriously unavailable for decades because of the handshake deal between Mel Brooks and George Lucas. Right now, it's everything's in the hands of the fates, and things change. I mean, if the world can support a Cabinet of Dr. Caligari action figure line, I feel like there's hope for anything out there. So, hey, keep waiting, keep hoping, keep putting the positive energy out there, and maybe we'll all see our dream toy lines happen one way or another. It just takes sometimes that champion and legal rights. If you like this video, please share it. That's the best way to help tell YouTube to pass it along to other people. It helps the algorithm, it spreads information, and it's positive for everyone. Thanks for watching. Let me know what toy lines you'd like to see updated in the comment section. What have you been waiting patiently for? I still want my spot in Marvel Legends, but that may still happen.